Hi, welcome you all to the session on harnessing generative AI in teaching and research. Over the next 30 to 40 minutes, I'll walk you through what it means to leverage the power of this innovative technology in your teaching and research endeavors. Now, even before we start, I think it's very important that I read out this disclaimer. Although this session will actually talk about generative AI for research and teaching, your use of these tools must be in compliance with the region that you are in, the applicable local laws, some of the institutional policies that you need to adhere by, and any other academic guidelines. Now, beyond this, you must ensure that the use of these tools aligns with ethical standards, you are protecting intellectual property rights in the process, and maintaining data privacy. And when you use these tools, it's very important to have the human in the loop, apply sound judgment, and exercise critical oversight. Read the output before you incorporate it and ensure that you comply with the regulations and best practices. And that may bring in certain additional responsibilities or restrictions that you need to adhere by. So, with that, let's begin the session. Here is how the agenda will pan out. I will briefly introduce generative AI to you, and then we will look at what generative AI means for academics. Specifically, we will then look at what generative AI means for a researcher. And when you function as a researcher and engage generative AI in some of your research processes, it's important that you tread with caution. We will then move into what it means as a teaching faculty and what does this entire use of generative AI mean for learning in the Gen AI age and some of the ethical issues that you need to be aware of. And we will touch upon some of these issues even as we go through rest of the slides without really parking it for the end of the session. So with that, let's begin. So what is generative AI? Now, as the definition goes, generative AI refers to deep learning models. And the key word here is generate. It generates high quality text, images, and other multimedia content based on whatever is the data that they're trained on. And this by itself is a huge differentiation vis-a-vis other forms of AI that have existed in the past. Now, what we have seen so far was predominantly in terms of analyzing data, but generative AI, as the term goes, generate, it produces new data. And that could be multimedia, text, code, images, video, audio, and whatnot. And in fact, Gartner, a leading research firm, believes that generative AI is going to become like a general purpose technology. It's going to have a huge impact on what we do, very similar to what we've seen with the steam engine, electricity, and the internet. Now, if you were to trace the evolution of generative AI, it's not really a new term, right? It's been there since way back over a decade or more than that, 2010 onwards. When 2010, we saw like this near perfect translation of natural language. But the more important aspect of it that we've seen in 2022 and even as we speak right now is the conversational aspect. Now, conversational, where you can engage with some of these tools through conversations, and which brings us to the point of one of these AI researchers talking about it being the hottest new programming language, being English. And the reason is very simple because most of the internet is in the English language, and that's the data that some of these tools are trained on, which makes English very crucial for what we call as prompt engineering, ensuring that we get the right prompts out of some of these conversational models so we are able to get the right output. Of course, that is a debatable aspect because of being English. So if you look at India being a multilingual economy, the multilingual demographics that we are in, India has also been at the forefront of some of these generative AI innovations. Now, India launched the Bharat Gen project, if you've been following the news, very recently, which actually supports generative AI in local languages. There's also Hanuman, which now speaks 98 languages worldwide. And these are some of the nuggets of information, nuggets of innovation that is happening in the Indian landscape. But with that, what we know so far, we've defined generative AI, we know what it means, we know the power of prompt engineering, we know that it goes with a lot of these conversations that is very essential to get the best output out of these generative AI tools. But what does this really mean for an academic context? Now, if you look at generative AI for academics, the World Economic Forum believes that generative AI can reimagine education. Sky's the limit. It's believed that generative AI is going to be a huge leveler. It's going to bring in a level playing field, especially from the aspect of diversity and inclusion. You will have generative AI opening up opportunities for some of those uh, learners for whom the content was rather inaccessible in the past. And academic use of AI is on the rise for teaching, especially. It can do a variety of tasks for researchers. It can enable, rather augment their creativity. But you got to tread with caution because it introduces new risks. And human expertise, the human in the loop, as we just talked about very early in this presentation, is still going to hold sway. And that's going to be very crucial even as we move forward. Now, we are looking at some of these changes, and they're happening even as we speak. If you look at some of the leading edtech players out there, Pearson has launched a generative AI tool which helps you have these conversations. And even it also happens with Coursera, that they've introduced Coach by Coursera, where across these tools you can actually have conversations with some of these bots, help you learn even beyond the classroom, even beyond these courses, understand some of the concepts, navigate through some of the processes, and enrich the entire learning experience that you would have otherwise had in the absence of Gen AI. So, generative AI tools are being explored already by some of these key edtech players, and it's happening as we speak. So, with that, let's now get into the core of the topic in terms of what does generative AI mean for me as an academic. Now, here's the way I look at it. For an academic, there are predominantly two paths. One is that of teaching, and other is of that of research. And we will deep dive into each of these aspects and understand what it means for generative AI in research, for a researcher, and what does it mean for a teaching faculty. Now, Gen AI for a researcher. I would like to break this down into three key areas: early stage, mid stage, and late stage in a research process. Where early stage is where you're predominantly brainstorming, ideating, doing your literature reviews. Mid stage is where you're getting a little deeper into writing some of these drafts, collecting data, and organizing this data, analyzing this data. And late stage is where you're actually submitting it to journals and engaging in reviews and so on. So with that, let's look at what generative AI can do for some of the early stages of research. Brainstorming, right? Now, creativity has long been a forte for humans, right? So we are exceptionally good at creativity, but AI is gradually reshaping that perception. Now, when you look at what's happening in the Gen AI space, there are tools out there which can actually engage as AI participants in some of these brainstorming sessions. Now, if you're actually looking for ideas, you're engaging in ideating sessions in very early stages of research with some of your other human participants, AI can come in as an AI participant and augment some of the creativity aspects that you would have otherwise been engaging with other collaborators. Now, AI is sparking creativity among the collaborators. It's nudging you to think more creatively. It's augmenting the human creativity that was already there. And not just that, it doesn't stop at that. It allows you to even prioritize some of your ideas and create solution drafts that you can take forward for any future discussions. And I have just put in a tool over here, Orchidia, is actually doing that. And just as an illustration, over here you see that once you're on this tool, you're just asking about how might we improve our customer experience. That's a little of a practitioner example. But once you do that, it's not just that the human participants are getting into the discussion and brainstorming, but it's also some of the AI participants that you see on the right, where it is actually nudging you with some ideas. It's actually helping you improve on some of these ideas. And not just that, it organizes that for you and helps you prioritize and create some of the solution drafts that you can take forward for any future discussions. Beyond brainstorming, if you want to create a grant proposal, That's where AI can actually come in. It can help optimize some of these grant writing processes. Some of the tools that you see there, like say Grantable, Hyperwrite, and on and so on, just by putting in a few key details like the details of the key personnel on the project, what is the funding request, that the amount that you are requesting funding for, the project description, and so on, some of the basic information, if it's put in, it can actually create a grant proposal for you. But when you do this, it's very important you look at it with caution, because there have been instances where some of these grants are rejected at an administrative level for plagiarism. And it's also quite possible because these tools are learning from data. Your data that you're putting in there, that's the grant text, that could get incorporated into some of the data training sets, and that could become public information tomorrow. So if your competitors are seeking similar grants or asking similar prompts in the future, your data is out there as training data, and it could well actually lead to your competitors getting an edge over you in the entire uh, grant process. Beyond that, beyond the brainstorming and the grant proposals, generative AI can also help you find some of these collaboration opportunities. What does this mean? Now, in some areas, it could actually be difficult to find collaborators because there are some institutional barriers, there may be some geographical barriers that you are trying to navigate. You're probably in one of these countries where it's hard to find uh, people who are working on this area that you want to research on. Now, like I said, if you're very isolated from the rest of the world, it could be difficult to find people who are doing similar research, but generative AI can actually come in and help you do this. Now, it can help researchers find connections. It can scan through the landscape based on whatever is the research question or the idea that you are looking to research on. And it can tell you who is collaborating on this topic, who are the researchers working on this topic, and how are they connected to one another across the different studies. With that, there is it is actually creating avenues for you to go out and reach out to other collaborators, potential collaborators who are out there, and try and see if you can actually build a collaboration opportunity. Now, this has probably been beaten to death. You will find a lot of instances where generative AI is being used for literature reviews. Now, some of the basic tools like say Copilot, it can help you brainstorm, discover say new perspectives on research topics. If you look at something like Elicit, it'll just help you identify some of the top papers in the field, even if you don't have the right keywords. Without the perfect keyword matching, Elicit can actually help you identify some of the top papers, seminal articles which have been published in this area. And not just that, it doesn't stop at that. It organizes these papers into, say, tables, and it provides any features that you may need for brainstorming research questions. Now, when you look at, say, something like, say, consensus, some of these papers may actually be hard for you to navigate. What consensus does for you is to enable a conversation. So you have this research paper, it can help pull answers from these research questions. So you just need to engage in a conversation with something like consensus. You ask questions like, okay, what was the sample size for the study? Which population was studied? What were the demographics? What were some of the methods that were used? And it will give you answers from these research papers. And that can be very handy if you're actually finding it challenging to navigate through any of these research landscape. And Research Rabbit, as the icon actually says, it helps you see connections between papers. Now, what that means is you know how the papers are connected across say themes or topics. It can also help you understand as to who are the if there are authors who are co-authoring certain papers in a topic, how are these papers connected, how are the authors connected, and some of these visualizations can actually not just help you with literature reviews, but can also help you potentially tap into collaboration opportunities that we just talked about a couple of slides earlier. Okay, so what did we know so far? We looked at early stage for a researcher. We looked at how it can help you brainstorm some of those ideas, identify, formulate some of these research questions, look at collaboration opportunities. So you've probably found a researcher now. You've done your literature review. You've got a sense of what themes have been discussed in the extant literature. But that brings us to the mid stage where you're now getting into data collection. You're also getting into writing some of these drafts. Now, AI for interviews and focus group discussions. If you look at AI back in the day, or even some of the basic transcription tools, they came in handy, but they were largely very inaccurate. Or even before that, right? So when you're in an intense discussion with one of the interviewees. Say probably you're in a focus group discussion, or you're probably interviewing somebody trying to get some insights for your qualitative study. You want to be focused on the discussion. That's what you want to be doing because that's your focus. Your focus is not really on transcribing or even making notes. You want to ask the right questions, you want to capture the right insights, and that's what you want to be doing. And AI works to help you in this entire process. When you talk about, say, AI meeting assistants, they not just record your calls, that's happened in the past as well. They also transcribe the audio and they store it all for later use. What this means is they extract information, they actually summarize, they point out some of the key highlights of the conversation. They're in fact able to navigate through it, identify what some of the challenges are, and even generate action items that can potentially do as a follow up interview with the same participant. And just to name a few tools, Otter.ai, it does real time transcription. And some of these tools are really getting better. In fact, Sonics supports even Indian languages like Hindi and Tamil with, with the global accent understanding. And some of these tools have gone very accurate with time. Now, if you talk the language, they're able to pick what you're saying and be able to accurately transcribe it. So that is something that is really improved with AI getting better and better by the day. Synthetic data. Now, what is synthetic data? Even before we talk about how it can accelerate research. And even before that, right? So if you're developing, say, models, these AI models, they need to be trained on large quantities of data. They're very data hungry. They need to devour a lot of data. And that is what they need. And this data has to be representative of reality. But given the context that you may be in, there may be some regulations, privacy issues, legal permissions that you need to get, which means that you may not be able to get all the data that you need to train this AI model on. For example, if you're in healthcare, it may be hard to get some of these data because it's PII information, it's PHI, personal health information that you're actually accessing. So it may be difficult for you to do that. And where synthetic data comes in is exactly here. Now, synthetic data, what it means is it represents or it replicates the statistical properties of this real world data that we're talking about. Very similar properties as the real world data, but it's an artificial data set. It's synthetic, as the name says. And what it does is it can actually serve as an alternative to the real data that you would have otherwise enjoyed having at your disposal. But all through this, it's very important that you're cautious of dealing with synthetic data because it is not representative of real people and it does not really capture the unknowns. So if you're in some of these real world scenarios where there are outliers, some of the aspects which are very human like, synthetic data may not actually be able to capture a lot of these unknowns and real representations that would otherwise be possible with real data. So synthetic data is great. It can help you train some of these AI models, but it could also reinforce some of the biases that were already existing in the real world data. Because what is synthetic data at the end of the day? It is trying to replicate some of the statistical properties. So that's what it's going to happen. Now, what have we done so far? We've collected data, we've transcribed data, we've also leveraged some synthetic data. But beyond that, AI can also help you automate some of the data organization, right? It can pull data from multiple sources, it can integrate them, it can clean and transform data. Data quality is something that can really happen very well with AI coming into the picture. Especially some of the automated aspect like inconsistencies, missing values, formatting data, ensuring that they're of the similar format, so on and so forth. That can really happen very well with generative AI. And it can also highlight some of those early trends and patterns that it's seeing in the data that may not be immediately accessible to the human eye. So something that may not be so obvious, it is able to uncover some of these trends and patterns in the data. And beyond this, it can, when you're doing some qualitative data analysis, it can actually process these large volumes of data. It can identify some thematic dimensions, patterns, and some of the themes that may emerge out of this data. So some of the coding aspects, it can also do that well. But all said and done, it's important that you go back, look at it, validate whether it is actually doing the right ways. It is actually following the right ways of coding this data. So that's very essential all through the process. Now, beyond that, given that we're in the mid stage, we've collected this data, we've used synthetic data, we've also used generative AI for some of the analytical aspects, but AI for academic writing, very important. is paraphrasing of text, especially for some of us who are non-native English speakers, who, for whom English isn't actually the first language. Paraphrasing can come in very handy. So it could actually make it easier for us to write some of those English sentences, make it more like a native English speaker. But be careful with the output. Make sure that it is not changing the meaning of whatever you wanted to convey. So the human in the loop really comes into the picture once again, right? So you got to be careful with what output is being generated by these Gen AI tools, and ensure maybe it requires further refinement before it is actually usable. And ensure that you're combining it with human accuracy and relevance, like I just said. And some of the tools that can help you, a lot of us have used some of these tools, like say very familiar at least, is AudioPen, Grammarly, PaperPal. So they focus on ensuring that your grammar is um, right, it is readable, it is not, it avoids some of the jargon, it helps you focus on improving the language, helps the reader, helps ensure that the text is comprehensible to the reader, and so on. All right, we looked at early stage. We've got a draft ready. We're at the mid stage. We've used it for academic writing. Now is the late stage where we're actually submitting it to journals. So there are some of these AI tools which are out there right now, which can actually check if the manuscript that you have fits the journal requirements. What it means is based on whatever the journal is, and what you see here is some snapshots from Penelope.ai, which actually looks at the abstract. It looks at whether the right keywords are there, whether you've got the right word count going, if you've got the right correspondence emails, and so on. Like, for example, it can also look at whether the figures are mentioned in the text. Does it comply with some of the requirements, the author guidelines that the journal actually puts out there? Are they in Arabic numbers, or are they numbered in the ascending numerical order, so on and so forth? So a lot of these hygiene checks, as far as complying with some of the journal requirements are concerned, it can actually help you get there. Now, even for a review process, if you look at, say, Springer Nature, which has introduced Snap, what it does is it makes a lot of things very easy for authors, even the editors and reviewers. Where for authors, it actually helps you upload the manuscript, auto populates a lot of data. For editors, it helps you track the papers through the review process, automated reminders are sent. And for reviewers, it can also ensure that there is calendar integration. It generates, say, uh, calendar prompts. It guides you through some of the important tasks, and so on. And it probably is going to get better as we progress. All right. Now that we've covered generative AI for researchers, it's very important that we navigate through AI assisted writing with caution. And before we even get to what generative AI means for a teaching faculty, I would like to touch upon a few aspects of treading AI assisted writing with caution. So pay attention to this, right? The field of generative AI in research is fast evolving. If you look at some of the articles from the past, ChatGPT was pretty much banned from not just being listed as a co-author, but even the use of ChatGPT was banned. But things have slowly changed where now the ban on this ChatGPT author papers has been overturned. They've been asking for some of these declarations of the use of Gen AI in terms of paraphrasing and so on. So the rules are changing by the day. It's a constantly changing landscape, and use of LLMs must clearly be disclosed, right? So that's something that most journals have been very clear in communicating, saying if you're using large language models in your manuscript, you got to acknowledge that. And for example, I've just put on a few snapshots here. Declaration of generative AI and AI assisted technologies in the writing process. What it means is you're using it for language, readability, um, and we used it with caution, which means the human in the loop was always there. We looked at it, we read it, we ensured that it is conveying the same messages when we paraphrased it further. And but just another example, right? So they clearly call out that they use ChatGPT and Google Gemini. Now, Verify before you use, and that's what you also saw in some of the acknowledgements in the previous slide. There is something called the CRAP test, where any info that is generated by some of these LLMs, ensure that the information is timely, it fits what you need. Look for the source of where this info is getting generated from, if there are any references at all. And is this reliable? Is this correct? And also examine why this info even exists in the first place. So before you incorporate in sources, apply the CRAP test as much as possible. But yes, I talked about something like the source of the info. Be aware that AI can actually generate fake references. And you see here, some of those news articles actually call out false citation rates and fake research papers on Google Scholar. Now, why does this even happen? Because these LLMs are designed to mimic humans. The output has to be human-like text. And what this means, there's something called compiler compression that is applied because they're trained on source data which is extremely huge. Compression is very essential. And what it means with compression is a loss of fidelity. So the accuracy pretty much goes down in the final statistical model. And this lossiness, as we call it, the loss of fidelity in the model, produces a fuzziness, which means it is primarily producing the most plausible statement, which means it is prioritizing coherence over accuracy. And in the process of doing so, it may end up actually generating fake references. So, what this means in short is there is pretty much very little ability for the model to evaluate if the output that it is producing is truthful or not. So that is where you got to be very clear and very careful, verify whether the reference actually exists or if it's just a fake reference, and spot some of the plagiarism traps. Because what is happening here, it is getting trained on data that is already out there. So it is quite possible that it may have reproduced substantial text from other sources. So you got to be very clear about this. You got to tread with caution once again. There is a plagiarism trap that you could land in if you're not checking what the content is being generated from some of these LLMs. And the content may have been compromised. Like I said, right? You ensure that all claims you verified prior to submitting it. And it's quite possible that LLMs may have generated false content. In fact, even the facts could be wrong. The citations, like we said, may not exist even. So it's very important that you look at it. It's in fact called FAIGC, fake artificial intelligence, fake AI generated contents. So that's what it means. So you got to verify if it is actually fake or it's for real. And definitely, ChatGPT is not an author. If you look at this article, um, it was listed as an author, but do not list ChatGPT as an author. But uh, ensure that you acknowledge the use of ChatGPT. And here's the bad news, right? Even AI text detection has issues. Now, if you look at some of these detectors, there have been differing opinions. There is a clear call out to be cautious of tools that detect AI generated writing. Some detectors claim to be accurate, but some also claim that AI detectors aren't reliable. And it gets even more worse if you're not a native English speaker, because some recent reports actually call out that AI detectors are biased towards non-native English speakers. And here is the reason, right? There is something called perplexity. Now, perplexity is a metric that actually correlates with the sophistication of the writing. So, what this really means is that the sophistication is much better if you're a native English speaker. So, the non native speakers are naturally going to trail their US born counterparts when you're looking at the perplexity score, which is actually about the sophistication of writing that it correlates with. Now, some guidelines is essential to call out when you're dealing with AI. Now, if you're doing research, do not play sensitive info because that could actually be problematic, if especially because it becomes a public record and it becomes open source because it could be used to train data. And if you're in a meeting which is a very sensitive one, ensure that you're not recording this meeting or even using any of these transcription tools or meeting summarizing tools, etc. Because again, these meetings then become public records. And all the more important is because you will end up working with vendors and subcontractors. it's important that you not just look at your own guidelines in terms of using GenAI, but you're also mindful of what these vendors and subcontractors use as far as their practices of using AI goes. So that's essential for you to understand if you're collaborating with other organizations. Now, we clearly said that, yeah, ChatGPT cannot be an author, but how do you cite generative AI models? We should acknowledge this fact. So that's very essential. There are some clear guidelines that a lot of these players call out. API has clear citation standards for citing some of these Gen AI tools. In fact, what they say is credit the author of the algorithm with a reference list entry and a corresponding in-text citation. So what you see on the left is a citation for OpenAI ChatGPT because the text was generated by ChatGPT. But going further, it is also advised that you put the full text of these ChatGPT responses because it's quoting it from a chat series, therefore more like sharing an algorithm's output. So if you have the details, or if you look at, if you kind of put it in the supplemental materials in terms of what text was generated, readers have full access to this text, and that could actually be the way to cite it. Okay, what have we talked about so far? We looked at generative AI for a researcher, and we also looked at how you need to tread with caution as a researcher when you're engaging with generative AI. With that, let's move on to what it means for a teaching faculty. If you're engaging with Gen AI in the classroom, what does it mean for you? An example, and I will pretty much look at some of the examples in which you could engage this. One of them is role play. Now, if you want to build a specific persona, you could actually use generative AI tools as a stand-in for a particular persona. So maybe there are participants in the classroom, and you want a debate partner, an AI debate partner, which can actually point out weaknesses in your arguments, some flaws. Or maybe if you're training your students for, say, placements or recruitment, you could actually create a persona of a recruiter, which is actually interviewing your students for a job, depending on particular context of a subject and so on. Or beyond this, it could just help students understand their material through the very conversational aspect that you're bringing in through generative AI. When you're building some of your quizzes and tests, it can ensure that you're creating content which is culturally sensitive, relevant, and also very inclusive and accessible based on whatever is the student's learning level. So that can really be one of those ways to engage generative AI. In a non-native English language speaking community, it could help, or rather you could encourage some of the students to use generative AI to look at English grammar, correct some of the aspects, use that for translation assistance, especially when they're struggling with English writing, or even just practice conversation with some of these conversational chatbots. For example, if you're creating some of these chatbots, which could actually be a great idea, so what could that mean? There could be different personas of these chatbots, right? So one of them is like being a course assistant. Now that could help students understand how a course works. Where can they find key content for the course? Maybe there are a few textbooks that they need to go and refer to. So that could be an assistant for the course. They can actually engage in a conversation with this assistant, or an assignment tutor. So that could help them go beyond their normal self and outperform themselves in completing an assignment, where this chatbot can actually help students do more than they could have done on their own, but at the same time ensure that this chatbot is not doing the assignment for them, but just helping them excel and go beyond their usual self. Or a process coach, if there are some complex processes, it can help them navigate through it, or a reflective guide at the end of the course, probably, right? So metacognition, just developing an awareness of what they're learning through the generative AI tools. Some interesting tools to uh, explore. Canva is one of them. If you want to generate images, text to image generators. I use DALL-E in some of the previous slides you could see, and I've put in a footnote, which actually says image created by DALL-E. Yet another one is QueryPod, which can actually help you create interactive lessons. Now, what that means is it has ready to run lessons that are generated with text, images, and activities such as polls and so on. And Eduate.ai, which is actually a teaching workspace. What it can do is help generate a syllabus, it can create discussion prompts, and it also has a teaching assistant that can help create individualized uh, pedagogies like educational program plans and even write emails for that matter. So we looked at AI for research, AI for teaching. So is that the end of learning as we know it, as we have always known it in the past? So what does generative AI mean for learning? We are probably at the crossroads. Is that what it is? Now, as educators in the AI age, remember that as a teacher, as a faculty, it's important to be more than just a human in the loop. Generative AI or not, you need to be the central driver in deciding how these tools, the generative AI tools, are being used purposefully in the classroom or in research or in student learning. And the human in the loop is essential. So it is only human augmented learning. The generative AI tools can assist, but you will continue to be the focal point, the central driver. And in fact, even Chat GPT needs teachers. So it's important that we train them the way we want them to be trained so they're able to perform in the way we want them to and augment some of the learning processes for us. But getting to skills in this AI driven world, the Gen AI driven world, some of the core skills that will come to the forefront. One of them is problem formulation. We have long looked at problem solving, but problem formulation will become a vital skill in terms of formulating impactful problems, asking the right questions. That is going to be a key skill that we will see in the generative AI age. Yet another one is exploration and experimentation, inquisitiveness, creativity, the curiosity. Exploring and experimenting will actually reign supreme in this Gen AI age. Critical thinking, all said and done, generative AI, critical thinking and reflective skills will be all the more important than they've ever been in the past with generative AI. And human agency, the human in the loop, that needs to be preserved along the way. As educators, it's our responsibility to ensure a few things. I've just put in a few aspects over here, like say data protection. Now, you need to be aware and you need to educate the learners in the classroom that generative AI is collecting data, maybe collecting data. You got to be aware of how this data may be used in training and so on. And from a motivation perspective, it's important to call out the human autonomy over other approaches, right? So the human autonomy needs to be preserved and the intrinsic motivation to learn needs to be there and encourage the learners in the classroom to engage in independent logical reasoning and avoid becoming addicted and or being over reliant on generative AI, encourage social interaction, encourage collaboration, and prevent learners from becoming addicted to Gen AI per se. Beyond whatever we've talked about, some of the ethical issues, right? You need to be aware of as educators is bias and discrimination. There could be biases, there could be discrimination, all said and done. So some of the responsible AI practices need to be borne in mind. Privacy and data collection, like we just saw, data privacy, data protection, it could, when we're using some of these systems, it could be collecting a lot of personal sensitive data. So be mindful of that and ensure that you are complying by the ethical guidelines. Autonomy and agency, they may actually offer recommendations that may not align at times. Uh, be mindful of that. Transparency and explainability, there could be areas where it's a black box, some of these algorithms. So you got to be mindful of that and navigate some of these ethical issues once again. And accountability and responsibility, that could be a gray area because you are engaging in these human AI collaborations. So it could actually introduce a gray area of who is accountable and responsible for some of these aspects. So that may create ambiguities in the allocation of roles and duties. So these are some of the ethical issues that you need to be mindful of as educators in the entire process. But that brings us to the end of the end of the session. Thank you very much for patiently listening to me. Good day.